Hello, everybody. Tonight I'm going to do what I said I probably wouldn't do, which is talk about my childhood stuff I forgot. Yet again, I really got to stop sabotaging myself by telling what I'm going to talk about next time because I changed my mind. And one of these days, I'm going to edit these things into a more chronological order. But as it is, my father told me that when it comes to the first draft, the rough draft, your attitude should be don't get it right, get it written. So that's what I'm gonna do. Get it spoken before my memory fades. Okay. So first, yes, we're going back to Belize. Yay. My father actually took me to St. George's Key, which was the site of the famous battle for which their national anthem was about. St. George's Key Day, their big holiday, and this celebrated the victory of the Baymen. Anyway, the bottom line is this celebrated the UK taking the territory away from Spain and gaining control over it. The government of Guatemala continued, and I guess still does, to insist that that was an act of invasion and not valid, and therefore Belize is Guatemala, or as they said on the radio over and over, Belize es Guatemala, which is a little absurd because the nation of Guatemala didn't even exist. And I did actually meet a leftist who told me I should say Belize rather than Belize because it's a Spanish word. Belize was a pretty good left-centrist democracy. Guatemala was absolutely fascistic. It was fascist, and they were starting to do a genocide on the Mayans, which I didn't know about until much later, but yeah, so stick that up your pipe and smoke it, uninformed leftists. Okay. My so when my father went to the most southernmost town that you could get to by private boat, I mean by a ferry boat, which was Punta Gorda, and he didn't just buy a plantation, he also made friends with a local Garifuna politician, pretty prominent politician in the area. Now, the Garifuna are a distinct ethnic group, and they came into existence when the group of indigenous people on St. Vincent, who were referred to by Westerners as the Caribs. So they were already there. And then the story goes that a slave ship full of African slaves got shipwrecked there and went into the jungle and met the Garifuna. The Caribs, who now call themselves the Garifuna. Actually, they already had that word, but they called themselves the Caribs when they were speaking English in those days. I don't know if that's true, but the bottom line is that a lot of Black people did join with these indigenous people on St. Vincent. They did form a distinct ethnic group, people who mostly look Black, rather dark, but they have high cheekbones. But culturally, they have a lot of the indigenous elements still. They have their own language, which can be traced to an indigenous language mostly, not to Africa. They have their own style of dress, food, and so forth. They were taken from St. Vincent to the Caribbean coast of Central America, where they still remain a distinct ethnic group and have had a bit of a revival, but I'm getting way ahead of myself. Anyway, this guy had a a nice house. He didn't live in a shack. He had a nice wooden house with a balcony, electricity, no indoor plumbing. You can't have everything. He wasn't a king, but he did have more than a lot of people had. He also had two daughters, and one of them was named, I'll call her Valerie, became important later on. And I remember I read a letter she wrote to my father, and she said, are you still fat? So, yeah. Anyway, it was a thing. When I got back to the United States, my father says that I ran up to a little black kid and embraced him and hugged him, and he pushed me away and started, yelling at me, cussing, whatever. So, gosh, what can I do? What can you do? So moving way ahead, about the age of 9, my mother and stepfather, I guess my father was out of the area somewhere. He moved to, they may have been back in Mexico. Anyway, they started going away first every other weekend, and they found these Irish babysitters. My brother was an infant, so obviously he didn't care one way or the other, and bonded with whoever was around. And that became every weekend, and there was another Irish family. One time, one of those guys in the father in the family much later said, we can tell it now, but sometimes we didn't even know how many kids we had. Well, there were a lot of kids, and I was not used to that. I was a solitary creature by that age 9. I was set in my ways, And so there were all these kids, including this rambunctious 2-year-old. I found a Monopoly game, and I don't know how well I understood the rules, but I played against myself. I played 2 roles, and every time I'd get money, I'd get like a little rush, as if I had really gotten, a bunch of money. So I enjoyed that, but then I found out that I couldn't do it with all those kids, a 2-year-old and so forth. And so I found a solution. The crib that the little baby, or I don't know, there was a crib empty. So I climbed into the crib with the Monopoly set and played by myself. So I suppose that might have seemed a little odd. I told my parents I didn't really want to go there anymore. And they said, well, you have a choice. We'll give you a choice. You can keep going there, or you can spend the weekends alone. And we'll give you, some food. They taught me how to make TV dinners and chicken pot pies. I remember those packaged frozen chicken pot pies being really good to me at the time. So I said, well, how about we try me being alone for the weekend? So I did, and I liked it. I definitely preferred that. So that was me already. Okay, going on. Other kids. So I remember this one kid coming over. My parents had a little statue of Pan in the front yard who was naked, because he's Pan. And this kid said, what's different about him than me and you? What's that? Well, he is naked and we're wearing clothes. I'm like, yeah. So he said, well, you want to go somewhere and get naked? I'm like, sure, whatever. So we kind of did this. We stripped in front of each other. And to me, it was really like, what's the big deal? I was pretty well used to nudity, it wasn't a big thing for me. But he enjoyed it. So, whatevs. And I had a couple of kids. So one of these kids, I guess I was about 7, and we'd watch the Flintstones and so forth. But this kid had an evil side. There was this one kid in our school, the bottom of the totem pole, the one that's always picked on. and he got the idea that this kid had cooties and needed to be picked on more. And he devised this ingeniously horrible plan, which to my discredit, I went along with. The plan was this: we would pretend to make friends with him. He didn't really have any friends. We would pretend to make friends with him. And that way, when we turned on him and started, picking on him, it would hurt him more, not just physically, but emotionally. Ugh, terrible. So I went along with I did not initiate it, and I did not physically hurt him, but I did get involved with the part where we were pretending to make friends, and we did that for a bit. And then I remember this other kid turned on him, and like he made this sound like, and like kicked him in the stomach, turned and kicked him in the stomach. Oh my God. Kids can be freaking evil sometimes, I'm telling you. Oy. So when I was about 9, I made a much better friend. I'm going to say his real name. He's kind of famous. His name was Keller Autumn, and he was being homeschooled. His mom was she was on the city council, and she had made a cookbook too. So she was, a working woman, and he was a house husband. So, this was like 70s style feminism. Now nobody can afford to. Both people have to work. That's not because of feminism. That's because of the freaking economy. But in those days, one person could afford to stay home. And so they chose for it to be the husband/father. He homeschooled him and drove him around and so forth. My mom was like, all he does with his life is drive this kid around. And she also said, homeschooling, school is tough, but life is tough. And life is all about dealing with tough situations and so forth. So it's not, implying that this kid would become like a hothouse flower who couldn't really deal with the real world once he encountered it. That did not happen. Actually, he grew up and became a famous scientist and science professor, very popular science professor, and he discovered how geckos climb walls. He was on the front page of the newspaper for discovering that. Yeah. So anyway, what we did was we started with, little toy animals playing this game where there was this alternative, animal universe where animals were intelligent and they just pretended not to be when people are around. And so at first we were doing this role playing, and then we just stopped with the toys and we continued doing it purely as a verbal thing with no physical toys required. Yeah. So I usually only had one friend at a time at most back then. So my poor little dog Mudge that we got from my parents, he slept with me, and he could not handle sleeping alone. When he was put in my room by himself all night, he just freaked out. He ripped the mattress apart. He ripped, he pooped. He howled and barked. And my stepfather said he went in and gave him a small dose of Valium, but it didn't stop. And he was afraid to give such a small life form anymore. Yeah, the Valium didn't calm him down. So he was a great dog, but could not stand to be alone. Okay. So my father, he taught a creative writing class in my mother and stepfather's house. My mother attended. Someone said she was the best writer in the group. She did become a writer of her own later, but not as successful as my father, which is somewhat limited as well. And but the big thing was people would come in, someone would come in and say, I have a great idea for a story. And he would say, don't tell it, write it. So you're not allowed to talk about ideas for things that you were going to write down until you had already written them, which most writers, there's this general idea you don't want to talk about a work in progress because you'll just kind of talk it out instead of writing it out. So that's understandable. But then later he got a case of a writer's block. And my mom said, why don't you try some LSD? That'll like liberate your mind or whatever. And he had taken LSD once in the Haight-Ashbury. So he enjoyed it. So he took it again at my mother and stepfather's house. My mother and stepfather were into this form of Tibetan Buddhism. My mom said that Guru Tarthang Tulku, they broke from him when he told her to go work in the kitchen. And she was like, I have my own kitchen to do stuff, cleaning in. But they were doing these rituals with drumming and whatnot. And my father was there in the next room tripping, and the drumming didn't give him a good start. So he started going into a bad trip. My mom came out and in her style, I guess he said he was going into a bad trip. And she said, well, just stop it, get over it. That's how she was. So of course the trip got worse. And he said he started seeing comic book characters from his childhood. So old comic book characters, such as, for example, the Yellow Kid. The Yellow Kid was like this idiot in a yellow smock, probably the forerunner, the inspiration for Alfred E. Neuman and all his imitators. So, Alfred E. Neuman. Oh, yes. He said that he was just seeing these idiotic characters and everything was just getting stupider and more banal and more stupid. So that was a bad trip. So he never took LSD again. Yeah. So when I was in Marinship, I had a variety of, I had a bunch of different teachers. One taught science. He actually taught me the concept of negative numbers and the binary system and the concept of matter and antimatter. I could learn all these complicated concepts. I just couldn't learn basic arithmetic very easily. We'll get to that. So I had this one teacher who was a narcissistic a-hole, in my opinion. I took a trip with my family and another couple. We got, a trailer, a recreational vehicle, and went to Death Valley, and an RV and a car. We went out to Death Valley, which was really cool, seeing the cigarettes embedded in salt, and because of the salt marsh. And at one point I saw a tiny little handprint, not on the outside, but on the inside of the windshield. It was smaller than any of our hands. And we realized it had 6 fingers. These little handprints had 6 fingers. I was, of course, sure that we had been visited by an extraterrestrial who somehow got into the car without breaking it or anything. Actually, it was probably a frog. Somehow a frog had probably gotten in. Anyways, I got back to this one teacher. Let's call him by his real name, Jack Hurley. And so he's like, okay, well, did you do what do you remember from the trip? What kind of vehicle were you in? I said, well, it was like a 4-wheel drive. And he said, that doesn't tell me much. That's just how the engine is connected. I didn't know that. He said, I wanted you to be able to draw a whole map of where you've been. And you never told me that. He said, yeah. And your mom isn't all that bright, so you can manipulate her and turn her head around. Jeez, man. He was chewing me out for things that weren't even true, like a Gasconite. He wasn't a Gasconite, but he spoke like one. On another occasion, oh yes, and I also taught told him about the kid, Jeff, who had backed me against a fence with his bicycle and bent my fingers backwards. And I said, well, I don't see how come you couldn't have defended yourself just by kicking the bicycle spokes. Like, it's not that easy, man. And on another occasion, that same kid came to the class and he said, his whole class was just talking about stuff, whatever. And he talked about, the Wright brothers and man being in the air. And that was kind of cool. But then when this kid, Jeff, showed up, he said, well, I'm going to talk mostly to him because he knows about boats and stuff. So that's what he did. Clearly wasn't capable of teaching two kids at once. So, yeah, that was my first clue that no, adults did not take what I called, and still think it's a good term, child-on-child violence, child-on-child crime, really. Things that would land an adult in jail, kids are just allowed to do, and people don't think that much of it, I thought that was an injustice, and it took the world a long time to catch up with me and do anti-bullying programs. Ay, ay, ay. So, anywho, then I went, yes, my parents had these friends, I'll call them Joshua and Irene. Joshua was a doctor. They were both doctors. He was an MD, like my stepfather was, and she was a psychologist. And he was just this really cool guy. I mean, he was a total stoner and acid head, but he was really cool. He could talk at a kid's level, he could talk at a teenager's level. He was easy to relate to. I was talking to him about, Milky Way's bars and saying, oh, they're stuffy, not fluffy, according to the commercial. And he said, well, yeah, they really are. They're good. And one time he said, guess what we're having for breakfast? I said, what? He said, French toast. And he was so enthusiastic. I could not bring it up, fortunately, to say that I didn't particularly care for French toast. Oy Gewalt. I was transferred back to public school. I was in this particular program where we didn't go from class to class. We basically stayed with one class with the same teachers, two teachers. It wasn't a bad program, I guess. It was all right. But I remember these two kids, they started chasing me and I started running. I don't know why. They chased me. I ran. They ran after me. And they didn't catch me. But it still was an act of aggression. So I told the principal, and he said, well, I saw one. I said, he's right there. That's one of the kids that did it. And the guy said, well, there's nothing I can do about that. And, he's not going to snitch on his friend. And the kid just smirked. And here again, I'm like, okay, nobody's going to take this shit seriously. Now I realize that these two were not tough kids. They weren't from the houseboats or the Marin City projects. They were middle-class white kids. I could have stood my ground and scared them very easily, but I did not know that yet, and I did not know how. Okay. I guess in grade school it was, before this, that a teacher just handed me a copy of the multiplication tables and said, here, memorize this. And I was like, how? I don't know how. I can look at it, but I don't know how to memorize all that. I wasn't good at rote learning. What I did learn of the multiplication tables came from these little cartoons. They had these educational cartoons on TV. And this was called multiplication rock. And so the tricks and stuff I learned about it come from that mostly, but I still find multiplying sevens to be very difficult. Wow. And then when I was in the 6th grade, I was presented with fractions. I mean, I could handle decimals, percentage points. Those were fairly straightforward. But then fractions were hard. And then when I got to multiplying and dividing fractions, I just could not pick that up at all. And math is kind of built on, you learn everything you learn is built on what you learned before. That's the way they teach it anyway. So I had kind of gotten stuck here. Yeah, my stepfather tried to help me to learn math. I was good at I was okay at word problems because other kids stumbled on the words. I was good at translating the words into the numbers. It's when I tried to do stuff with the numbers themselves that it was hard. So they were bad with words. I was bad with numbers. It kind of evened out. Anyway, my stepfather would he had a very gory, morbid sense of humor, which I kind of liked. It suited me. And he did these, he would write out these word problems that had a sufficiently gory, text to keep me interested. But once again, once I got to the numbers themselves, it didn't matter. I wasn't good with numbers. I had some dyslexic tendencies, which did not affect my ability to read. I think it affected my ability to spell a little bit, or somewhat, maybe a lot. Definitely affected my ability to do math, especially when it got to that in reversing numbers and oh God, never mind. What a headache. Okay, so now I'm going to talk again about my friend Daphne that I met at the flea circus. So I remember one time we were hitchhiking and she said she had to go a bit into the woods to pee. So she did. And I kept hitchhiking and a car stopped. I guess I was 11 or so. A car stopped. And then I called her. I said, "Hey, we got a ride." And she ran out and we got the guy was like, "That's not cool, man. That's not cool." He assumed we had done it directly as a way to catch a ride. Anyway, he gave us a ride anyway. And on another occasion, she painted us both in theatrical makeup as wood nymphs, and we walked around downtown Mill Valley, and one guy was looking at us, and I said, "We're wood nymphs." And then later she said, "You don't tell people, you just do it. You don't tell." So, okay. So I kind of scrambled my words when I talked about what she said when she woke up on the night I talked about. What she actually said was, "I don't feel safe out here anymore. I'm going back to my room. You can either come with me to my room or go back to your father's room." And I, for some reason, chose to go back to my father's room and later regretted it. So, Milo Milkbone Yapopoulos, the attention hound, kind of ruined his career by going on a podcast and saying that the priest he had an affair with when he was 13 wasn't a bad guy and it wasn't a bad experience. But he was a conservative pundit as well as an a-hole. And at any rate, I'm not a conservative pundit and I have no career to ruin. So I'm just telling it how it was. Okay. Anywho, that scene didn't last too long. My father got an apartment in San Francisco on Clement Street, which was a cool area at the time. It was a blend of Russian and Chinese culture. Now it's mostly Chinese. He called it Manchuria because of the Russian Chinese thing. And it was a nice apartment. It had a bunch of rooms in it, you know. Those were rents were cheaper back then. But of course, he moved out because he moved. That's just what he did. And so another couple moved into that apartment that he moved out of, and they became friends of mine. And yeah, someplace to go when I was unwelcome at home on the weekends, which became a thing. By the way, my younger brother stayed going to these Irish babysitters and bonded with him. And like, so when he was not particularly welcome at home, he wound up having these two other, you know, straight laced Irish families to visit. And I just went wherever I could. Uh, yeah. So that's a thing that happened. One of these days I'm gonna edit all this to make it be in a chronological order. Once I figure out how to do that and have, you know, stuff to edit, enough stuff to edit. And right now, I think that's enough for this video. So thank you and good night.